My wife's lucky I didn't leave her years ago. My husband laughed into his wine glass while the people around our table forced out polite little chuckles. And in that moment, under the golden chandelier light of the Palmer House Ballroom in downtown Chicago, I realized I had spent 34 years becoming invisible beside a man who could no longer remember who built his life with him. I kept my smile perfectly still because women my age learn how to survive humiliation quietly. The charity gala around us sparkled with crystal glasses, black tuxedos, and soft piano music drifting across the crowded ballroom, while servers carried plates of filet mignon and roasted asparagus from table to table. Thomas leaned back in his chair like he had just delivered the cleverest line in the room. "You all know how hard it is living with someone who still prints directions from MapQuest," he added, shaking his head dramatically. More laughter followed. Not cruel laughter exactly. The uncomfortable kind people use when they want to stay on the good side of a wealthy man. I lowered my eyes to the gold-trimmed dinner plate in front of me and folded my hands carefully in my lap so nobody would notice they were trembling. Once upon a time, Thomas used to brag about me. Back when we were younger, when his hair was still dark and our first tiny apartment smelled like burnt coffee and ambition, he used to tell people I was the smartest woman he'd ever met. But success changes certain men. Or maybe it simply reveals them. Over the last 10 years, as his logistics company grew larger and our social circles became richer, Thomas slowly transformed into someone I barely recognized. He started correcting the way I dressed, then the way I spoke. Then eventually, he started pretending I had nothing worth saying at all. "Relax," he whispered beside me now, nudging my arm lightly. "People know I'm joking." I looked up at him. At 62 years old, Thomas Carter still carried himself like the star athlete he once was. Silver hair perfectly styled, tailored tuxedo hugging his frame, expensive watch catching the ballroom lights every time he lifted his hand. Across the table, a younger woman from the board laughed a little too hard at his comments while touching the stem of her champagne glass. Thomas noticed. He always noticed. "I'm relaxed," I said softly. My voice sounded distant even to me. Somewhere near the stage, a microphone squealed briefly before the room quieted. The charity director stepped onto the platform with a bright smile and began thanking sponsors for attending the annual Children's Hospital fundraiser. Thomas immediately straightened in his chair. Tonight mattered to him because his company was desperate for a merger deal, and rumors said one particular billionaire investor might attend. That was the real reason he'd insisted I come despite spending the entire drive downtown complaining that I was taking too long to get ready. "Smile a little more," he muttered under his breath without looking at me. "You always look miserable at these events." I almost laughed at the irony of that. The director continued speaking warmly about generosity, compassion, and community while giant screens behind the stage displayed photographs of smiling children and grateful families. Then her tone shifted slightly. "And now," she announced, "we'd like to welcome our final keynote speaker of the evening. A man whose foundation has donated more than $200 million to children's healthcare initiatives across America." The room immediately erupted into applause. Thomas sat forward so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "This is him," he whispered excitedly. Jonathan Vail actually came. I had heard the name before, of course. Everyone had. Billionaire investor. Tech visionary. One of the most powerful businessmen in the country. But the second he stepped onto the stage beneath the bright white spotlight, my breath caught painfully in my chest because Jonathan Vail stopped walking almost immediately after looking out across the ballroom, and for one long silent second, his eyes locked directly onto mine. For a second, the entire ballroom seemed to disappear around me. I could still hear the soft clinking of silverware and distant piano music, but Jonathan Vail's expression pulled me backward through time so suddenly that my chest tightened beneath my navy silk dress. He looked older, of course. The last time I had seen him, he was 36 years old, exhausted, buried in debt, and sitting across from me in a cramped office with rain streaking down the windows while he tried to convince investors not to abandon his company. Now he stood beneath a spotlight worth millions of dollars, his tailored tuxedo fitting him like armor, his silver hair perfectly combed, his posture calm and commanding in a way only powerful men ever seemed to master. Yet somehow, the moment his eyes met mine, I saw the same desperate young entrepreneur from 25 years earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," the charity director said warmly, Please welcome Mr. Jonathan Vale." The applause grew louder. Thomas clapped enthusiastically beside me while whispering under his breath, "This is incredible. If I can just get 5 minutes with him tonight, everything changes." I did not answer. Jonathan slowly approached the microphone, but instead of beginning his prepared speech, he kept looking directly toward our table. I noticed the slight confusion spreading across the ballroom as people realized something unexpected was happening. Even Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Finally, Jonathan smiled faintly. "I apologize," he said into the microphone, his deep voice calm and polished. "I just had a very surprising moment." A few people laughed politely. He loosened one cufflink absently before continuing. "You spend enough years building companies and attending events like these. Eventually, every ballroom starts looking the same. But once in a while, you see a face that reminds you who you used to be before the money, before the headlines, before people started pretending you were important." My stomach tightened. Thomas glanced at me briefly, then back toward the stage. 25 years ago, Jonathan continued, I was 1 week away from losing everything. My company was collapsing. Payroll checks were bouncing. Investors were leaving. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. More soft laughter drifted through the crowd. But there was one person in that office who understood the numbers better than anyone else. One person smart enough to find the mistake none of us could see. My hands slowly folded tighter together in my lap. Thomas shifted again beside me. "That woman," Jonathan said quietly, "saved my company before it even existed." The ballroom fell completely silent. I stared down at the white linen tablecloth while heat crept slowly into my face. Thomas gave a short, awkward laugh. "Well, that is dramatic," he muttered softly. Jonathan continued speaking, but now his voice carried something more personal beneath its polished confidence. "The funny thing about success is that people always assume the person standing on stage did everything alone. They never see the people quietly holding the foundation together behind the scenes." My throat tightened painfully because I knew exactly what he meant. 25 years earlier, I had been working as a senior accountant while Thomas chased bigger commissions at his shipping job. Back then, our son was still in middle school, our mortgage payments terrified us every month, and I spent most evenings balancing budgets at the kitchen table after dinner while Thomas watched sports in the living room. Jonathan had entered my life during one of the hardest years of our marriage, though Thomas never paid much attention to my work. He used to joke that accounting was just organized homework for adults. I never corrected him. I never corrected anyone. "Some people save your future," Jonathan said carefully, still looking toward me, "and they never ask for recognition afterward." Beside me, Thomas finally stopped smiling. Thomas leaned closer toward me, lowering his voice enough so the people at nearby tables could still hear pieces of it. "You know him?" he asked carefully, though I could already hear the tension tightening underneath his words. I kept my eyes on the stage. "A long time ago." "How long ago?" I could feel him studying my face now, trying to calculate something he did not fully understand. Before I could answer, Jonathan continued speaking. "Back then, I thought success belonged to the loudest person in the room. The one with the strongest handshake, the sharpest suit, the boldest pitch. I was wrong. The ballroom remained completely still. Nobody touched their food anymore. Nobody checked their phones. Jonathan had the kind of presence that made even wealthy people sit quietly. "The person who saved my company," he said, "was a woman almost nobody noticed. She worked late every night while everyone else chased attention. She caught a financial reporting error that would have destroyed us during our first investor audit. If she had not found it, there would be no Vale Industries today." My heartbeat felt painfully slow. I remembered those nights too clearly. The tiny office with flickering fluorescent lights. Cheap coffee that tasted burnt after midnight. Endless spreadsheets spread across my desk while snow fell outside the windows of downtown Chicago. Jonathan had looked exhausted back then. Brilliant, but reckless. He understood vision, not details. The accounting discrepancy had been buried beneath hundreds of transactions, small enough for everyone else to miss, but dangerous enough to trigger federal scrutiny if investors discovered it later. I found it at 1:30 in the morning after staring at numbers so long my eyes burned. I still remembered Jonathan dropping into the chair across from me when I showed him the mistake. "Can you fix it?" he had asked quietly. "Yes," I told him, "but only if you stop pretending you already know everything." For the first time in years, The memory made me smile faintly. Beside me, Thomas noticed immediately. "You never told me any of this," he said sharply. His voice stayed controlled, but I recognized the warning underneath it. Thomas hated surprises he could not control. "You never asked," I answered softly. Across the ballroom, Jonathan slowly stepped away from the podium as giant screens behind him displayed photographs from his company's early years. Old offices, tiny teams, folding tables serving as desks. Then suddenly, one photograph appeared that made my breath catch completely. I was standing near a whiteboard wearing a gray sweater and holding a stack of financial reports against my chest. My hair was darker then, pulled back carelessly, my expression serious and focused while talking to someone outside the frame. A quiet murmur spread across the ballroom. Thomas stared upward at the screen, confusion spreading across his face. "That is you," he whispered. I could not answer. "Most people in this room," Jonathan continued, "have probably never heard Evelyn Carter's name before tonight. But every major success in my life traces back to one woman who told me the truth when everyone else was too busy trying to impress me." The room erupted into applause. Real applause this time, not polite charity applause. I felt frozen in my chair while strangers around the ballroom turned toward me with startled expressions. A woman at the neighboring table leaned closer and smiled warmly. "Why did you never tell anyone?" she asked. I opened my mouth slightly, but Thomas answered first with a stiff laugh. "My wife has always been modest." The words sounded strange coming from him because modesty had never been my choice. It had simply become the safest way to survive beside a man who needed to be the most important person in every room. Jonathan looked directly at me again before speaking one final sentence that made Thomas go completely silent. "Some men spend their whole lives standing beside extraordinary women without realizing it." The applause seemed to last forever. I sat perfectly still while dozens of strangers looked at me with sudden admiration, the kind people reserve for someone they believe matters. It felt strange after so many years of becoming smaller inside my own marriage. Thomas adjusted his cufflinks twice in quick succession, a nervous habit he had never been able to hide. "Well," he said quietly with a forced smile, "this has certainly become interesting." I could hear the irritation hiding underneath every carefully chosen word. Jonathan stepped away from the podium as several executives rushed toward the front of the ballroom, hoping to speak with him first. But before security could guide him toward the VIP section, he turned directly toward our table. The room seemed to notice immediately. Conversations softened. People watched openly now. Thomas straightened in his chair and buttoned his tuxedo jacket as if preparing for an important negotiation. "Jonathan," he called warmly once the billionaire approached our table. "Thomas Carter. Carter Freight Solutions. We have several mutual contacts in logistics." Jonathan shook his hand politely, but only briefly. "Of course," he said. Then his attention shifted immediately back to me. "Evelyn." Hearing my name in his voice after so many years unsettled me more than I expected. He smiled softly. "You look exactly the same when you are thinking too hard." I laughed quietly before I could stop myself. Thomas noticed. "It has been a very long time," I said carefully. 25 years, Jonathan replied. "I still remember the first thing you ever said to me." I shook my head faintly. "I doubt that. You walked into my office holding 3 binders and told me my financial reporting system looked like it had been designed by a gambling addict." A few people nearby laughed immediately. Even I smiled despite myself because I remembered saying it. Jonathan's eyes warmed slightly. Nobody had spoken honestly to me in months at that point. Everyone else wanted stock options or attention. You were the only person focused on whether the company would survive another week. Thomas forced another smile. "Evelyn has always been detail-oriented." The comment landed strangely between us because I suddenly realized how small he had made my abilities sound for most of our marriage. Detail-oriented. As if decades of financial expertise could be reduced to remembering grocery lists and balancing household bills. Jonathan seemed to notice too. "Detail-oriented," he repeated calmly. "Thomas, your wife rebuilt our entire investor reporting structure in less than 10 days. She saved us from an audit disaster that would have ended the company before we secured our second funding round." Thomas blinked. "I had no idea she was involved at that level." "That is unfortunate," Jonathan answered politely, though something colder had entered his tone now. Around us, Several board members and donors lingered nearby, pretending not to listen while clearly listening to every word. I suddenly became aware of how exposed Thomas felt sitting beside me. For years, he had controlled every room we entered together. Tonight, for the first time, that control was slipping away in front of wealthy people whose opinions mattered deeply to him. Jonathan turned toward me again. I tried to find you a few years later, he admitted. But someone told me you had stopped working. I lowered my eyes briefly. Life became busy. What I did not say was that Thomas hated how much time my work required once his own career started growing. He never demanded I quit outright. Men like Thomas rarely say things directly. Instead, they make your ambitions feel selfish little by little until abandoning them starts feeling like love. That was a mistake, Jonathan said quietly. Thomas shifted beside me again. Evelyn preferred focusing on family, he interrupted smoothly. Jonathan looked at him for a long moment before responding. Did she? The silence afterward felt heavier than anything spoken all night. Thomas laughed softly after a few seconds, but the sound felt thin and strained now. Well, he said while reaching for his wine glass, marriage involves sacrifices. Evelyn wanted stability for our son, and my business was growing quickly back then. Jonathan studied him carefully. Interesting, he replied. Because from what I remember, Evelyn was the stable one. The nearby silence deepened. I noticed two women at the neighboring table exchange a quick glance before pretending to focus on their desserts again. Thomas cleared his throat. You know how those early years are. Everybody struggles. Some people struggle more quietly than others, Jonathan answered. Then he looked back at me with an expression that carried genuine regret. You disappeared before I could properly thank you. I folded my hands together gently. There was nothing to thank me for. Jonathan smiled faintly. That sounds exactly like something you would say. A server arrived with fresh coffee, offering a brief interruption that allowed Thomas to regain some composure. He immediately shifted into business mode, leaning slightly toward Jonathan with practiced confidence. I have actually followed your expansion into freight automation very closely, Thomas said smoothly. Carter Freight Solutions has been positioning itself aggressively in that market. I would love to discuss opportunities sometime. Jonathan accepted the coffee cup politely without breaking eye contact with me. Is that so? Thomas nodded quickly. We have grown substantially over the last decade. New distribution centers, regional contracts, major retail partnerships. It has been a strong run. I recognized the tone immediately. The performance voice. The one Thomas used whenever powerful people entered the room. Confident. Relaxed. Slightly louder than necessary. But for the first time in years, I also noticed something else underneath it. Fear. Jonathan finally turned toward him fully. And Evelyn has been involved in the company. Thomas hesitated only briefly. Not directly, he admitted. She has mostly stayed home these past several years. Jonathan's expression changed almost invisibly. That seems like an extraordinary waste of talent. The sentence landed harder than Thomas expected. I saw it immediately in the way his jaw tightened before he forced another smile. Evelyn never seemed particularly interested in corporate life. Jonathan looked at me again instead of responding to him. Is that true? I stared into my untouched coffee for several seconds before answering honestly. I stopped believing anybody wanted to hear my opinions. The silence afterward felt almost physical. Thomas shifted in his chair again. Now hold on, he said lightly. That is not fair. But even he sounded uncertain this time. Jonathan leaned back slightly, studying us both with the calm patience of someone who had spent decades reading rooms full of powerful people. Do you know what I remember most about Evelyn? He asked quietly. Thomas forced a polite smile. What? She never spoke unless she had already solved the problem. A few people nearby laughed softly again. Jonathan continued. Back then, investors constantly interrupted meetings trying to prove how intelligent they were. Evelyn would sit quietly for an hour, then ask one question that exposed everything everyone else had missed. Heat rose slowly into my face again. I had forgotten those meetings. Forgotten how confident I used to sound. Before years of marriage slowly trained me to apologize for taking up space. Jonathan glanced toward the ballroom stage where several event organizers were waiting nervously for him. Actually, he said after a moment, there is something I would like to do before I leave tonight. Thomas immediately straightened again, hope flashing briefly across his face. Of course, he said quickly. Anything. Jonathan stood slowly from the table. Tomorrow morning. he said calmly while looking directly at me. My executive team is holding a private strategy breakfast at the Four Seasons. Evelyn, I would be honored if you joined us. Thomas blinked in complete surprise. For breakfast? Jonathan nodded once. No offense, Thomas, but I was inviting your wife. The drive home through downtown Chicago felt colder than the January air outside the car windows. Snow drifted lightly beneath the streetlights while Thomas gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his jaw rigid beneath the glow of passing traffic. Neither of us spoke for nearly 15 minutes. The silence between married people after public embarrassment has its own weight. Heavy, careful, dangerous. Finally, Thomas exhaled sharply. Why did you never tell me any of that? He asked without looking at me. I kept my eyes on the city outside my window. You never seemed interested in hearing about my work. That is not true. His answer came too quickly. I turned toward him slowly. Thomas, you used to call my accounting job adorable. He immediately frowned. I was joking. You also used to tell people I worked with calculators while real businessmen built companies. Come on, Evelyn. And every time I tried talking about work at dinner parties, you changed the subject. The car grew quiet again. I watched his expression tighten as memory forced him to recognize things he had spent years dismissing as harmless humor. I did not realize you took those comments so seriously, he said finally. The sentence hurt more than the original insults somehow, because it revealed the real problem. Men like Thomas rarely notice the exact moment they begin shrinking the women beside them. It happens slowly. One interruption at a time. One joke. One dismissive glance. Until eventually, the woman herself forgets she was ever intelligent before becoming useful. We pulled into the driveway of our house in Winnetka just after 11. The stone exterior looked elegant beneath the porch lights, exactly the kind of expensive suburban home Thomas had dreamed about owning when we were younger. I used to love this house, back when it still felt like ours instead of his. Thomas shut off the engine but stayed sitting there for a moment. Jonathan inviting you tomorrow changes things, he said carefully. I looked at him quietly. What things? He hesitated. Well, obviously there could be opportunities here. There it was. Not pride. Not apology. Opportunity. Even now, after everything that happened tonight, Thomas still viewed my value through the lens of what it could bring him. You mean opportunities for your company? I said softly. For us, he corrected quickly. I almost smiled at that. Interesting choice of words after telling everyone tonight that I was lucky you stayed married to me. Thomas immediately sighed with frustration. I was making conversation. People joke at those events. At whose expense? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in years, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. Not anger. Fear. Because tonight had shifted something neither of us fully understood yet. Inside the house, I removed my earrings slowly while Thomas loosened his tie in the kitchen. The familiar rhythm of our marriage suddenly felt unfamiliar. Like two actors still performing roles after forgetting the script. You should go tomorrow, he said eventually. To the breakfast. I looked up from the marble counter. Why? Because if Jonathan Vale still respects your opinion after all these years, that matters. I stared at him quietly. It only matters now because another powerful man said it out loud. Thomas looked away immediately. The truth of it sat heavily between us. Upstairs, while brushing my hair in front of the bathroom mirror, I studied my reflection longer than usual. Fine silver strands framed my face now. Softer eyes. Lines earned through decades. Of compromise and silence. But beneath all of it, for the first time in years, I recognized something I thought had disappeared completely. The woman Jonathan remembered. The woman who once walked into conference rooms without apologizing for being intelligent. My phone buzzed softly against the bathroom counter. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. I opened it slowly. I meant what I said tonight. The world became poorer the day you stopped using your gifts. Breakfast starts at 8. I hope to see you there. Jonathan. I barely slept that night. Long after Thomas had fallen asleep beside me, I remained awake staring at the ceiling while snow drifted softly beyond the bedroom windows. Jonathan's message stayed open on my phone screen beside me like a door I had forgotten existed. The world became poorer the day you stopped using your gifts. I read this sentence at least 20 times before finally setting the phone down. Nobody had spoken to me that way in years. Not with admiration. Not with certainty. By 7 the next morning, Pale winter sunlight had begun filtering through the kitchen windows when I walked downstairs wearing a cream wool coat and the navy blouse I used to wear to client meetings years ago. Thomas looked up from the breakfast counter immediately. Surprise flickered across his face before he quickly masked it with a smile. "You look nice," he said carefully. I poured myself coffee slowly. "Thank you." He watched me over the rim of his mug for several quiet seconds. "You are really going." I said I would think about it. And I looked directly at him. I spent 30 years thinking about everybody else first. He lowered his eyes briefly at that. "Evelyn, about last night." I waited, but the apology never fully arrived. Instead, he rubbed his jaw and sighed heavily. "I know I joke too much sometimes." Sometimes. The word almost made me laugh. Men often describe years of disrespect as occasional mistakes once they realize the room has changed against them. "Thomas," I asked quietly, "when was the last time you asked me what I actually wanted from my life?" His expression shifted immediately. Confusion first. Then, discomfort. Because he genuinely did not know the answer. Neither did I. For years, my wants had slowly disappeared beneath schedules, dinners, clients, school events, networking parties, mortgage payments, and the endless invisible labor women perform without applause. Finally, he said softly, "I thought we were happy." I looked out the kitchen window at the snow-covered backyard. "You were." The silence afterward stretched painfully between us. At 7:30, a black town car pulled into the driveway outside. Thomas stood immediately and glanced through the window. "Jonathan sent a car?" I gathered my purse calmly. Apparently, something inside him tightened visibly at that moment. Not anger exactly. Panic. Because powerful men understand status instinctively, and Jonathan Vale did not send cars for ordinary favors. "I could come with you," Thomas offered quickly. "There is no reason for that. Evelyn, this could become an important relationship for both of us." There it was again. Us. But now the word sounded transactional instead of loving. I walked toward the front door slowly, then stopped beside the entryway mirror where family photographs lined the hallway wall. Vacations, Christmas mornings, graduation pictures, decades of smiling beside each other while something essential quietly disappeared underneath the surface. Thomas stepped closer behind me. "I never meant to make you feel unimportant," he said quietly. I studied our reflection in the mirror for several seconds before answering. "The saddest part is that I do not think you even realized you were doing it." His face fell slightly because he knew I was telling the truth. Outside, the driver opened the car door politely as cold January air rushed across the driveway. Before stepping outside, I turned back toward Thomas one final time. "You asked me last night why I never told you about Jonathan," I said softly. "The truth is, every time something good happened to me, I learned very quickly not to shine too brightly around you." He stared at me in complete silence. Then for the first time in many years, I walked away without waiting to see whether he approved. The private dining room at the Four Seasons overlooked Lake Michigan through enormous glass windows washed in pale winter light. Everything inside felt quiet and expensive in the understated way truly wealthy places often do. Soft gray carpets, fresh white orchids, waiters moving silently between tables carrying silver coffee pots and warm pastries. I paused briefly near the entrance after the hostess led me inside because for the first time in years, I felt uncertain whether I still belonged in rooms like this. Then Jonathan looked up from across the table and smiled immediately. "There she is," he said warmly as he stood to greet me. Around him sat 6 executives in tailored suits, all of whom turned toward me with polite curiosity. "Everyone," Jonathan said calmly, "this is Evelyn Carter, the smartest financial strategist I have ever worked with." I actually laughed softly in disbelief. "That is quite an introduction." "It happens to be true," he replied without hesitation. The breakfast meeting moved quickly after that. Market projections, transportation technology, supply chain restructuring. Within minutes, the conversation shifted into areas I had not touched professionally in decades. Yet something strange happened as I listened. The numbers still made sense to me. The patterns, the risk assessments, the hidden weaknesses buried inside polished presentations. It all returned faster than I expected, like a language my mind had never truly forgotten. One executive finished presenting a regional expansion proposal before Jonathan turned toward me casually. "What do you think?" Every face at the table shifted toward me at once. For one brief second, Old instincts returned immediately. Stay quiet. Do not interrupt. Let the important people speak. But then I remembered Thomas laughing beside his wine glass while strangers smiled politely at my humiliation, and something inside me hardened calmly into place. I lifted the proposal from the table and studied the numbers carefully. Your fuel cost assumptions are unrealistic for second quarter distribution, I said quietly. The room went completely still. The executive blinked twice. Excuse me. I pointed toward one section of the report. You. Projected based on stable freight contracts, but smaller carriers have already started raising rates due to Midwest labor shortages. If you expand under these assumptions, your operating margins collapse within 18 months. Silence. Then Jonathan smiled slowly without even looking surprised. Exactly, he said. The executive stared down at his own paperwork before giving a reluctant nod. We actually noticed some pressure there last week. Jonathan leaned back comfortably in his chair. You see why I wanted her here? The room shifted after that. Not dramatically, just enough. Suddenly people listened more carefully when I spoke. Questions started coming directly toward me instead of around me. For 3 hours, I sat at that table discussing logistics strategy, risk management, and financial forecasting while something buried beneath years of silence slowly came back to life. Confidence. Meanwhile, across town, Thomas sent me 4 text messages in less than an hour. How is it going? Did Jonathan mention the merger? Let me know if I should come by later. Remember to mention our expansion plans. I did not answer any of them. Near the end of the meeting, Jonathan dismissed the rest of the executives while asking me to stay behind for coffee. Once we were alone, he studied me quietly for a moment before speaking. You know, he said softly, I spent years wondering why someone with your mind disappeared from the business world completely. I stirred cream slowly into my coffee. Life became complicated. Jonathan nodded once. No, life became smaller. The sentence settled heavily into the silence between us because deep down, I knew he was right. He folded his hands calmly on the table. Evelyn, I am launching a new advisory division this spring. Strategic oversight. High-level financial risk analysis. I looked up carefully. Jonathan's expression remained steady. I want you to help lead it. I stared at Jonathan for several seconds without speaking because at 61 years old, after decades of shrinking myself to fit inside someone else's comfort, I no longer trusted sudden opportunities. You cannot be serious, I said quietly. Jonathan smiled faintly. Across the coffee table. That is the exact same expression you had 25 years ago when I offered you your first executive position. I shook my head slowly. That was a long time ago. Talent does not expire because somebody ignored it for a few decades. The words settled deeply into me in a way I was not prepared for. Outside the restaurant windows, snow drifted softly across Lake Michigan while downtown Chicago moved in the distance beneath a pale gray sky. For the first time in years, the future felt unfamiliar again. Not frightening exactly, just open. My phone buzzed once more against the table. Thomas. Again. Jonathan glanced briefly toward the screen before looking back at me calmly. You do not have to answer that. I surprised myself by smiling. I know. That small realization alone felt strangely powerful. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. Evelyn, I am not offering you charity. I am offering you responsibility. Yesterday, you identified flaws my own executives missed after 6 weeks of analysis. I have been out of the industry for years. No, he corrected gently. You have been out of rooms that appreciated you. I lowered my eyes for a moment because I suddenly understood something painful. Somewhere along the way, I had accepted Thomas's version of me as truth. The quiet wife. The supportive woman behind the scenes. The aging spouse lucky to stand beside a successful man. I had worn that identity for so long I stopped remembering it was something handed to me, not something I chose for myself. Jonathan slid a folder carefully across the table. Inside were proposal documents, compensation figures, travel schedules, and a formal advisory contract with my name already printed across the top. My hands trembled slightly as I stared at it. The salary alone exceeded anything I had ever earned in my entire career. You prepared this already? I asked softly. Jonathan smiled. The moment I saw you last night, I knew 2 things immediately. What? First, you never should have disappeared from this industry. He paused briefly. Second, I suspected somebody spent years convincing you that disappearing was the right thing to do. My throat tightened painfully because the truth no longer felt deniable once another person finally said it aloud. Across town, Thomas was probably still waiting for updates about merger opportunities and business introductions, while completely missing the real shift happening underneath everything. This was never about his company. It was about my life. I finally looked up from the contract. And if I say yes? Jonathan's expression softened. Then I think 6 months from now, you are going to recognize yourself again. I laughed quietly through unexpected tears gathering in my eyes. You make it sound very dramatic. No, he replied calmly. I think losing yourself slowly is dramatic. Finding yourself again is simply recovery. Later that afternoon, I returned home just before sunset. Thomas was already waiting in the kitchen when I walked inside, his expression tense with anticipation. Well, he asked immediately. How did it go? I removed my gloves carefully before answering. Jonathan offered me a position on his advisory division. Thomas blinked hard. A consulting role? An executive advisory position. Silence. Full-time, if I want it. He stared at me as if seeing someone unfamiliar standing in his kitchen. Then finally he forced a tight smile. That is amazing, Evelyn. But beneath the smile, I could already see it beginning. The realization that the woman he spent years treating like background decoration no longer needed his permission